continue on diving into what we know and what's upcoming in terms of the funeral. We want to bring into the conversation right now Michael Haynes, Senior Vatican Correspondent. Thank you so much for joining us here on Live Now from Fox. I know we've already spoken to you today, but what more do we know about this funeral service? We saw the prayer and rosary service. What comes next in terms of all the things in place at the Vatican?
Well, in fact, just a few minutes before I joined you, the Vatican issued the official certification of Pope Francis's death. So the medical professionals there issued a statement to the press corps. They stated that the Pope had a stroke, coma, and irreversible cardiac arrest. And they mentioned also his recent medical history of bilateral pneumonia, arterial hypertension, and multiple bronchiectasis. Apologies for the mispronunciation there in the medical terminology, but this was the formal certification that is part of the normal procedure, but nevertheless highlights the sort of the underlying conditions of the Pope's health and the true import of what happened this morning.
Yeah, and of course, we're getting more information about that. And you mentioned the health as he spent 30-plus days at Gemelli Hospital from that double pneumonia, finally being released from the hospital, showing up at the Easter ceremony. Can you speak to that? Because he said that he wanted to be the Pope for life, and that's certainly what he accomplished, but overcoming some of these health obstacles to stay very active with the faith, active as this Pope in the Catholic Church. Can you speak to that? And now that we know some of this information, what Pope Francis was able to do in his final days?
Indeed, so there had been a lot of talk or speculation about a possible resignation, especially as his stay in hospital continued and his condition worsened. Pope Francis has always sort of brushed off that suggestion. He's always been very keen to, I think, remain in power, to remain as Pope. He wasn't going to follow the example of Benedict XVI. So his decision was always to remain in office, I think, until he died, although he would toy with interviews sometimes when they would pose the question about the possible resignation. But I think that was something we saw in evidence on Easter Sunday, the fact that he decided to come out to deliver that Urbi et Orbi blessing and then to make a tour of the square. Quite a considerable length of time he was there without the use of his oxygen, although you could see that he appeared very physically frail. He had his mouth open a lot of the time, presumably, I imagine, to just aid in getting air. So that always has been part and parcel of the Francis pontificate. It's received criticism also in terms of how he has used power in his pontificate, but that's always been a central aspect to understand his 12 years on the throne, how he employs and understands his own power as Pope and how he wields it. And it seemed that his decision was always to die with his boots on, as many have commented already.
Yeah, and of course, that was the final moment, really, that we saw him there in front of so many people acting in that humble way that he is so very well known for. I do want to put up this again, as you talked about it, this certificate of death, the cause of death for Pope Francis revealed officially due to cerebral, stroke, coma, and irreversible cardiac arrest. Previously had that acute respiratory failure and the bilateral pneumonia. Of course, we were detailing that very, very closely. There's a post from yourself, Michael, about this revelation that we are gathering right now. And of course, we talk about the life and the funeral that will be upcoming, but in the Catholic Church, they also talk about the death of the soul. Can you speak a little bit more to that and why it is so important for Pope Francis and the Church as a whole?
Indeed. So the Catholic Church always teaches that physical death indeed is one thing, but also that we have an immortal soul which never dies. And that's why we have such great teaching on the true import of actions, whether actions are sinful or not. We have the classifications of two kinds of sin, venial or mortal sin. And the Church teaches that in order to attain heaven, then one must not die in a state of mortal sin, that is, to die in a state of having an unconfessed or unrepentant mortal sin on one's soul, which is why there is such a concentration of prayer around the Pope particularly, because as the Pope leading the flock on earth, he has such a weighty responsibility, and why there's a necessity really for all Catholics to have a filial devotion to the Pope in terms of especially praying for his spiritual well-being, because none of us take for granted that by virtue of one's position or by virtue of lofty office, that means one is somehow safe in the terms of salvation. In fact, the dangers are greater, the higher the responsibility. And so the Church teaches that, especially for the Pope, but even more so than for others, there is that duty to pray for him, to particularly to continue to pray after death. There's we don't wish to move into areas of ceasing to pray for him or to say such lovely epithets about him that we no longer think he's in need of our prayers. The Church always has this very constant emphasis on continued prayer, no matter if it's before or after death.
Yeah, that's a good point and a good revelation about the hierarchy, both there now and what his role was as the Pope, because he really talking about the humility there as he continued to have concern for the poor from the very beginning for that 12-year papacy. Let's take us back a little bit, 12 years ago, because it was a humble beginning for Pope Francis, taking the name of Francis. Can we detail that a little bit? Because I think that greatly symbolizes what his term as Pope was about, just taking on the name Francis.
Indeed. So the name Francis, obviously, he was the first Pope to take that name. And I think much has been made of this. He's given quite an attention to those elements. He's tied into elements which he's seen in Saint Francis, who is the Franciscan saint that he took the name of, particularly relating to areas of nature. He's tried to employ some of Saint Francis's attention to nature in more of his ecological writings. Some of those have been sources of a lot of controversy in the Catholic Church because of the Pope's attention to those over other aspects. But that being said, the Pope has also been quite notable in terms of his issuing calls for peace, which have been really increasing. He's been making those on a regular weekly basis now in his Sunday addresses, often his general audiences on Wednesdays, in which he always calls to mind that it is the poor especially who suffer, the innocent who suffer as a result of wars. And he's tried to renew those aspects, those calls, as conflicts seem to increasingly emerge across the globe. But at the same time, the papacy that we've seen over these last 12 years has also certainly been one of confusion, really. There's been a lot of division within the Church over many aspects of the Pope's pontificate, and those will now have to be addressed, I think, by his successor, whoever that turns out to be.